Sensation and perception, chapter 3. This is the sensation is the physical stimulus. I'm touching this podium, I can feel it. Okay. When I drank my coffee and ate breakfast this morning, I could taste it. That's nice. Most of the time. Occasionally I get something I taste that I wished I didn't, but most of the time I like it. And I can see you. That's a sensation. Okay. And so the physical stimulus detects the energy of the stimulus, whatever it is you're touching or seeing or hearing, whatever, and it sends it into the nervous system. Perception is what you interpret from the sensation. Okay, I feel this. It's, okay, it's hard. It's a little cool of all things. And, or if I touch a hot stove, I get the sensation real fast, okay? And it's kind of like a friend of mine that we were in a crowded kitchen at his home one day, and he hopped up on the stove to sit down. His dad had just turned it off. He got a sensation. and those sensations are good because it makes you move when you need to. And my uncle had an injury in World War II, and he had no feeling in his leg, and he would hike or had a job doing where he did a lot of walking, and he would get terrible blisters on his foot and never know it. Dangerous blisters, they were so bad. And so it's a good thing, but we interpret all of these things. Sometimes we can see the same event and interpret it differently. And we'll talk about why that is the case. Gestalt said there's some rules of perception. He said there's a rule of similarity. If you look at somebody that maybe you identify with your faith, you would kind of see them as similar. You would make interpretations based on that. Proximity, objects that are close to one another are associated. Continuation, your mind can follow that. If you were to say, where would that continue to go? You could just kind of follow that pattern, even though it stops. In your mind, you fill in those blanks. Okay. And speaking of filling in the blanks, closure, we mentally fill in the gaps. You see a triangle in the bottom right. Okay. It's not a complete triangle, but you see it because your mind fills in the gap. Now, we're going to try to talk about how this affects us in life. Another thing that affects perception is attentiveness, catching the details, avoiding distortions and gullibility. How many times have either we done it or we've talked with somebody or watched somebody do it when you're in some kind of discussion and either you or they start jumping ahead of what's being said, and they interpret what's going to be said, and they miss it. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about. Okay? They're not being attentive. That's what makes somebody gullible. That's how people can trick you with something. You don't catch the details. I heard one just recently. A guy was saying something about, we passed a cemetery, and he said, all the people that live around the cemetery, they're not allowed to be buried there. Really? Well, yeah, they're still alive, And the people that live there, and it's kind of gullibility. But being attentive to things is very important. In discussions, debates, theological discussions, you need to be attentive to the details. I had a discussion with somebody once, and it went on for a long time, a theological discussion at a place where I was working in the summer. And really nice guy. I had a lot of respect for him. I think he did for me. But we were really getting into this, and we couldn't get on any common ground. And finally I looked at him and I said, well, here's how I define sin. How do you define sin? And when we made the definitions clear, we actually pretty much agreed, and we had spent I don't know how long in this, this discussion. We didn't have all the significant details. Okay, that affects your perception if you don't have the details, attentiveness. Context, you interpret everything by context. And this is why even in counseling, sometimes what we call, you don't need to know these terms, not until next semester if you take Intro to Counseling, but when you're counseling, if a counselor, what's called transference is when you're counseling somebody and they start to identify you with some memory or some person, you remind them of somebody they hate. It's a little bit hard to counsel them because, when you say something, it's just, because they're reacting in context, because you remind them of somebody. Countertransference is when the counselor does that, and to somebody. And we put things in context. Some people are very comfortable with living in the city. Other people, it's like, I don't want to be here, I don't want to get out on the streets in the city or whatever. And other people do the same with the country. I can remember a guy that came to, we lived on the Pell City Campground. I don't know how many of you have been to the Pell City Campground, Alabama, but we thought we were offering him kind of an extra little nice room on the other side of the campground from everybody else. Nobody lived over there. I would have just thought that was wonderful, nice and quiet and peaceful over there. And he was so embarrassed, and he came back and said, this is embarrassing, but I'm just going to be honest with you. Man, I'm used to living in the city. I mean, there's neighbors just, I can just nearly touch their house. And the thoughts of going over there and being over there all by myself, and this was a big guy, but he said, I'm just going to tell you, can one of these other guys go over there with me? Context. I lived there. I didn't even think about that. I'd go over there late at night and walk through those dark buildings and just didn't think about it. Because I had a safe context. Now, I may not have been safe, but at least my context felt safe. Because nothing had happened, And so we interpret things through context. You might be discussing the same issue, and because there's a negative context to it to you, you're reacting against it. And the other person's trying to figure out what is wrong with you. Why do you think this way? Sometimes I just say that to somebody.
Also, sometimes if you don't have enough context, you can't make an intelligible answer.
Absolutely. Good point. One of the examples I put down there is seeing people out of the setting. I have that a lot. I meet people here, and then I go somewhere, and I see this person, and I say, I know that person, but I don't know that person. Who is that person? And or they come up to me, and they say, hey, Brother Miles, how you doing? And it's just like they know me really well. And I'm thinking, who is this person? Who is this person? And I see them out of context, and I can't. And I finally, either I fake it and just say hi, great to see you, thinking all the time, what's your name? I hate to make them feel bad that they know me and I don't know them. Sometimes I just take the humble route and say, look, I am so sorry. I know I'm supposed to know you. And lots of times they will say, don't you remember in someplace in Michigan or somewhere? I preached in their church or whatever, and immediately, when they put the context in, I know exactly where I've seen them, and often, not always, because I'm terrible with names, and you will find that out. I will call you by your wrong name, trust me, I will. And it'll embarrass me, hopefully not you. You just laugh at me and say you love old people, okay? Brother Avery's already said it, so I guess you can. And but that's context. You see them in context or out of the context. And then prior learning, we learn to identify or think in patterns. Maybe one of the examples of this, I was teaching a large Bible class, maybe my first year here. And I made a statement. Now, I wasn't in the church when I was real young, but started going when I was in upper elementary school, got serious about it a little older than that. And I made the statement in class that the church basically has been very good to me. My experiences have been very positive. Now, all of my experience has been positive? No. But overall, when I think of the church and the body of believers, I have very positive thoughts. I mean, we're not perfect by any means, and I said, obviously that's not the way it is for a lot of other people. And I looked across that large class. There's probably about as close to this many in the class, probably 60 some in the class. I guess we have not quite 60 in here. And several of the students said, that's right, it hadn't been good for me. Well, now, do you think that's going to affect how we think toward the church, toward God? It will. It has to affect us. And that's why the community of Christ is so important, that we treat each other well. You're not always going to get it right. Everybody's going to, you're going to get disappointed. Nobody's perfect. I have disappointed people that I love the most, okay? And I'll never get it just all right. But I hope I've created a situation where they know that I love and care for them, and they're safe around me. And so our prior learning is very important. How we are reared by our parents. Now, my dad was a good man, good father, had a lot of problems. When I was a young fella at home, I didn't always appreciate what he did and didn't understand it until I learned that he never talked about his past. It was as though he didn't even have a childhood. It was never mentioned in our home. And what I learned from my mother and his sisters and a couple of friends, and it was bad. I mean, my dad had a really bad childhood. And so when he learned to think kind of defensively, okay, he learned that he didn't matter. He learned that he really couldn't trust people to care for him. And so he was very, very sensitive. I mean, he could get upset and hurt. I always saw it as upset, but it was because he was probably hurt. Very upset very quickly, because it was like reaffirmation that there's something wrong with you. You're not acceptable, you know. And that's the pattern he had learned. On the other hand, he had learned that he wanted to give his kids a home because he never had one. And I took that for granted. I took a friend home. I took lots of friends home. I would take a carload of friends home. And my mother would know how many people to cook breakfast for by how many lumps were on the floor in the morning. And she'd never complain. My dad never complained. And one of those friends that I took home came from a home that he didn't really feel too comfortable to go to very often, so whenever I went home, he went home with me. Kind of almost became part of the family. And he asked my dad one time, I was not there, he said, "Mr. Miles, why do you allow Richard to bring all these guys home?" And Sonny told me, I said, "What did he say?" He said, "Well, he told me he never was allowed to have any friends in his house. They get run out on the street. And he made a promise that he would always, his boys would always be able to bring their friends into this house." And there were 4 of us. And my poor mom, we overran the place. I mean, our place was the hangout. Always. Well, he had learned both good and bad ways of thinking from his childhood. Everybody has.